Welcome and thanks for tuning in to our From the Book podcast. Here we publish past sermon and sermon series to supplement our spiritual growth. Our current series is an in-depth study of the book of Acts, where we are learning about the church on the move.
Acts 27 is where we're going to be. We're almost done with our series in the book of Acts. I think this is sermon 58. Man, that's the longest study that I have done so far, at least in this setting anyway. Acts 27, you're going to start in verse 27 here in a moment, but Paul and 275 other passengers caught in a storm, a deadly storm, a dangerous storm, an enduring storm, a storm that just seemed to last and last. Seemed like it had no end. You remember, it was what we said, the kind of storm that could make you desperate. Just didn't look like it was going to let them survive. In fact, Luke even tells us that everyone on that boat lost hope that they would survive. They all lost hope. But God sent an angel and tell Paul everyone would survive. They would lose the ship, but all the people would survive. And Paul relays that message to everyone. He says, everyone, right in the middle of the storm, he says, everyone, be of good cheer. He says, I serve God, and he told me that everyone was going to be just fine. And why could Paul be cheerful, and why could he tell people to be cheerful? Well, Paul was confident of this. He said this, these are your key words, I believe God. That's all. I believe God. I don't believe what this storm says. I don't believe what the condition of our boat says, because Luke tells us later on that this boat was breaking apart. The back part of this boat was done. It was fixing to fall off into the sea. And if you lose the back of your boat, you don't really have a boat. And so everybody's reading the situation. But Paul says, no, I believe God. He used his hope to give other people hope. And here's what believing in God can do for you. Believing in God and not your storm can keep you calm in the middle of the storm. Yep. The storm doesn't have to be calm in order for you to be calm. And remember here's what we learned from storms last week. Number one, the storm doesn't have to end for God to be in control. Remember, God's in control if there's a storm going on or not. Second, we talked about this. The storm doesn't have to end for you to have God's presence. And they were in the middle of the storm, and God sent an angel. I'm still with you. God said, I didn't leave you. The objective is still the same. In your storm, God still is present with you, and actually nearer to you. Number three, the storm doesn't have to stop before you can hear from God. You know, if you listen in a storm, if you listen in a hard time in your life, the Bible says this, that there is a still small voice that God gives to you. It's a calm in the middle of the storm. Number four, the storm doesn't mean that you've lost your purpose. Sometimes if you're going through a storm in your life, you start to believe a lie, and that lie is that God can't use you. And it doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter. Paul still had a purpose in his storm, and it was to reach out to a needy people who didn't have any information about God. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But being in a storm doesn't mean that you've lost your purpose in life. And we need to remember that, because, look, it's really easy to lose sight of how God is in control when you are under a lot of pressure. It's easy to lose sight of that. But here's what's interesting to me. We stopped at verse 26 last week, and Paul already addressed everyone on that boat that everybody was going to be fine. Paul said, we're not going to lose a single person. In fact, Paul would say later on, no one is even going to lose a hair on their head. It's a pretty bold statement. But he said that, and here's what's interesting. After he said that, the storm still didn't stop. We would expect that a promise was given and the storm stopped immediately after that. That's not what happened in the text. Paul gave this word from God and hope from God, but the storm was still raging outside. In fact, it would continue several more days beyond that. And so do you know what the other passengers needed in that moment? They not only needed, and here's what I'm going to argue, that they not only needed a voice of hope, everybody's going to be just fine. They not only needed a voice of hope, and Paul gave that to them, but they also needed to see how that kind of hope is lived out. They needed an example. They didn't need to just hear it, they needed to see it. They needed some good, here's the argument. They needed some good Christian leadership. A good Christian example to help guide them through the storms in their life. Because look, storms are hard enough for us to navigate. Storms are hard enough for us to make sense of and to respond to. I think even Paul may have been confused in this storm at first, because Luke told us that everyone on the boat lost hope. I take that to mean everyone. I think even Paul was confused. Storms are hard. And that's even with us knowing that there's another life beyond this life for us to look forward to. But can you imagine going through a storm and trying to make sense of this world when all this life is what you have to look forward to? Remember, storms are clarifying. Storms make you start to consider what's really important, and you start looking for answers. And just like we want answers for our storm, I would say this, that there is a whole secular world out there looking for answers in their storm. That's what I would say. And here's what I think. I think as God's people, we need to be ready and we need to be willing to lead them in a right direction. There are people in Uvalde, Texas, who are in a storm and need to be led right now. They need to be led in a right direction, because somebody can come in and lead them in a wrong direction, couldn't they? And so part of what we need to be praying for them is that God's people in that area would step up and give them some good leadership in the middle of their storm. And really, there are people, because of Uvalde, Texas, trying to make sense of this evil, evil world, who need to be led in a right direction, because it's easy to be led in a wrong direction. And so I hope that you'll find this passage helpful this morning, because we're going to see that while Paul is caught in the storm with everyone else, he was ready and he was willing to give some wisdom and counsel to a group of people who needed some answers. He was willing to show some Christian leadership and help a people who didn't have God in their life to start thinking about God in their life and start making sense of a situation. And you know, I think that's still our responsibility. I think it's the responsibility of God's people to provide some Christian leadership to people who need answers, to teach them by our example how to respond and how we can respond to the storms of life, because we know how confusing storms can be in our life. So that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. I want to talk to you about this, how to be a leader in a world that needs an answer. How to be a leader in a world that needs an answer. Are you ready to read with me? Are you ready to study? The Bible says this: "But when the 14th night was come, and as we were driven up and down Adria, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country." They didn't know where they were, but there was something up ahead, "and sounded, and found it 20 fathoms. And I'll talk about that in a minute. "And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again. They found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should fall upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day." And really so they could see. Remember, it was midnight. It was still dark, and they couldn't see where they were. "And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship," now that's interesting, "when they had let down the boat into the sea under the color as though they would cast out the anchors of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, 'Except these abide in the ships, you're not going to be saved.' Then the soldiers, they ran over there, cut off the ropes from the boat, and just let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, 'This is the 14th day. This day is the 14th day that you've tarried and continued fasting and have taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you." And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And they were all of good cheer. And they also took some meat, some food. And we were all in the ship, 216 souls. That's 276. And when they had eaten enough, they had lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves into the sea, loosed the rudder and the bands, hoist up the mainsail of the wind. You didn't know you were going to get a sailing lesson today, did you? And made toward shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, not willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest on some boards, the rest of broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land, just like God said. Isn't that amazing? How to be a leader in a world that needs an answer. All leadership is an exchange of influence. That's all leadership is, an exchange of influence. And here's what people around you need from you. The people around you need your influence to be stronger than their influence. They don't need to influence you. You need to influence them. So here's a few thoughts from the passage that may be helpful to you. First, I want you to write this down. It should be in your notes. When the world is struggling with crisis, we need to lead them with integrity. When a world around us is struggling with a crisis, we need to lead them with integrity. Luke tells us that it had now been 14 days since they had been caught in that storm, and they'd been blown far off course. And when it was all said and done, they really, when you look at the map, they had been carried about 475 miles. They started, they found an island of Clauda they were trying to get to. They weren't able to get to Clauda. And eventually they were cast off 475 miles to an island called Malta. But at that time, there was no way for them to know that. But God gave them a message of hope. But inside that message of hope, the wind was still blowing. The waves were still tossing them around. And here's what we learned from Luke. Remember that the back of the ship was starting to break apart. And the back of the ship breaking apart means that you sink. That means that everyone isn't saved. That means everyone dies at sea. In other words, to a secular mind, someone who didn't believe God and never thought about God before this moment, it sure did not look like God was in control. It sure didn't look like they were going to be saved, like this crazy person said. And so you know what happened? Because they were in a crisis, what usually happens in a crisis? Well, fear takes over. That's what happens in a crisis. Luke tells us that because they didn't know where they were, for safety reasons, because they might have found some land, they started sounding the depths. That is, they were dropping a line down from the ship to see how deep the water was. And one of the times they sounded, suddenly discovered that the water was getting more shallow. They sounded at 20 fathoms, the Bible said, and that's about 120 feet. And then they went a little bit further, and they sounded again, and they found that it was 15 fathoms, and that's about 90 feet deep. And these experienced sailors were suddenly worried that they were going to hit some rocks. So they told everyone they were going to let down 4 anchors. You remember reading that? We're going to let down 4 anchors for safety reasons, they said. That's what they told everyone. What was really happening, though, was the shallow water meant that the sailors could make a run for it. They said they were letting down 4 anchors, but really they were trying to secretly let down the lifeboat to see if they could save themselves and row themselves to safety, and leaving everybody else on the boat to die. Well, Paul sees all of this happening and tells the guards, hey, unless you can sail, unless you're really good at running a boat, we're not going to survive if these guys get away. They're trying to sneak away with the lifeboat. And they are our lifeline. And so what happens is the soldiers ran over and cut the rope to the lifeboat and just let it loose from the ship, and that took care of that problem. You're not going anywhere. We're all stuck together. Can't use a lifeboat you don't have. But here's what I want you to see. Don't be surprised when lost people think and act like lost people. They're just trying to save themselves, and they were in a crisis, and fear took over, and so they did the most selfish thing that they could do. If there's someone out there trying to make sense of the world and trying to respond to their own crisis without knowing God, they're going to have a lot of trouble. Haven't you seen those crazy videos of people melting down at fast food restaurants because they didn't get their food order right? That's gold on the internet. You'll just take up hours and hours of your day. It's amazing. That's a little bit of an extreme example, I know, but it could be that you overhear someone at work talk about how they're going to get someone back because they were mistreated in a meeting. Because why? Well, when people think they're in a crisis, they do some really silly things. Or how many of you know that kids' sports make parents a little bit crazy? It could be that a parent on your kid's team is just mean and disrespectful, maybe a little bit obnoxious. Sometimes fear makes people act in ways that are a little less than honorable. You remember the great toilet paper shortage of 2020? That was weird, wasn't it? It's weird times. We've grown a lot together, I think. They did that all because of fear. And because they were fearful, they were selfish, really, really selfish, actually. Just like the sailors, because of fear, they weren't thinking about anyone else on the ship. They were just thinking about how to save their own lives. They weren't thinking with a biblical worldview. How could they? And we could probably think of some more crises together, some serious, some ridiculous. But I tell you that people who are caught up in stuff like that just need a little bit of clear-headed thinking. You know what they need? I would argue this. They need some leadership. But in my experience, Christians, just for the sake of being nice, just because it seems like the nice thing to do, tend not to say anything. We tend not to be confrontational. Or even worse, we get caught up in a crisis like everyone else, and if people are all buying toilet paper, this is where it really gets bad, we start doing the same thing. We let their crazy rub off on us, and we become crazy. But here's what we need to learn. People in crisis need to be led. Leadership is an exchange of influence. They don't need to be influencing you. You influence them. How did Paul lead with integrity? Because we need to do it with integrity. We need to do it in the right way. Well, first of all, he stood up and he called out a wrong when he saw it. Did you notice that? He called out a wrong when he saw it. Now, he had to use some soldiers on this occasion. Sometimes you need to call the police, don't you? You don't need to intervene in everything, do you? But on the other occasions, what did Paul do? He wrote a letter. He used a pen. On other occasions, he called out wrongs in his own teaching. But here's what I want you to see, that confronting wrong is a part of Christian leadership. It takes integrity to call out a wrong. And it takes integrity to do it in the right way. In my experience these days, it looks like a lot of us are scared to tell anyone that they're wrong. We don't want to offend people. We don't want to hurt their feelings. We don't want to lose a relationship. We're afraid of confrontation would be awkward. I don't want to talk about that. It would be awkward. We just silently wish that people would just get it. You ever wish that to yourself? I just wish you just get it. I don't want to have to tell you this. I wish they would just get it and just do the right thing. But let me ask you, has that ever been your experience with sin? No. It doesn't. A lot of things, they don't self-correct. Do people usually just come to their senses on their own? Or does sin, let me ask you this, does it usually get worse and worse and worse? If people think that they can get away with sin and the conditions are there, the conditions are right for the sin, they'll do it. And God's people need to be conscious of that inside the culture. How are they going to know if we don't tell them? It might not be as serious as a situation as it is with Paul, but leading people in your life with integrity and helping them see what's important in their life and in every situation, I think you can do that. You might need to remind someone just simply this, just to tell the truth. You ever called somebody out to tell them to tell the truth? Had to pull them aside and say, hey, that's wrong. You need to tell them what really happened. You might need to be the one to help someone see that they need to change their attitude. Like you're not responding to the situation correctly. You might need to have a hard talk with someone who needs more responsibility in their life. It's a hard talk. You wish they'd just get it, right? You wish that they would just be responsible on their own. But sometimes they won't. It won't self-correct. And just leaving it alone is entropy. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Maybe you do need to have that hard conversation. You might need to be the one to remind someone, hey, that's wrong, because no one else will say it. You might need to be the one who has to remind someone at work that hiding a wrong only makes it worse. And here's something else to think about. Like Paul, you might have to be alone when you do it. You see, integrity demands that you stand for what's right, even if it means that you have to stand alone. Leadership can be a lonely place. Is that true? I like what one preacher said, loneliness is the price you pay for convictions. It's a good line. Sometimes you might be the only no in the room. Sometimes you might be the only yes in the room. Yours, like Paul, might be the only voice calling something wrong. That's okay. Stand alone if necessary. Whatever you see out there in your life, I want you to do this as God's people and as members of the Lake Worth Baptist Church. I want you to lead with integrity. Lead with a moral sense of rightness and help others do the same. Expect others to do the same. The world needs it. Crisis can bring out the worst in people. A desperate situation can make people desperately selfish. And they need leadership to guide them. They need our integrity. Now, there's something to be said for good timing, right? There's something to be said to be said for grace. There's something to be said for a good attitude, and we should pray about all of that when the time comes. But people, listen, people aren't going to be helped by our silence. They need to be led with our integrity. We live in a pretty morally confused society. And sometimes you'll see it in your family. Sometimes you'll see it with your friends. Sometimes you'll see it at work. Sometimes you might see it in church. You'll find it all over the place. Paul found it in a boat. People were struggling with a crisis. But I want to tell you this. We never need to be afraid to step up and call something wrong if it's wrong. Second, when the world is struggling with personal beliefs, you know how we lead them? We lead them with a public faith. A faith that is public. I love how Paul addressed this situation after he foiled the plans of some sailors who were really about to doom everyone on the ship. These men were going to try to make a run for it. It's a pretty selfish move. Not a lot of honor here. Those passengers weren't sailors. The soldiers weren't sailors. And if they would have gotten away with this would have been a death sentence for everyone else on board. But I want you to look at verses 33 through 34. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that you've tarried and continued fasting. You hadn't eaten anything. You hadn't had a bite to eat. Wherefore, I pray you to take some meat, take some food. He says, this is for your health, for there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. He didn't yell at them. Look at this. He didn't lecture them. Shame on you. He didn't say that. He said, you know what we need? We all just need to take a minute and have a lunch break. We just need something to eat. And I like that. And Renee, we probably could have a new life verse right here, because here you have actual biblical evidence that sometimes the best thing you can do in a stressful situation is to have a meal, and we say, praise God. Praise God. Amen. Yep. It's a new life verse. But I want you to notice something with me. Paul was on a ship with a bunch of secular people. Is that true? A bunch of secular people. In fact, the only two Christians that were on that boat that we know about were probably Luke, who's cataloging this story for us, and Paul. Everyone else was just part of everyday secular society. And what I mean by secular society is that they don't know God like we know God. They didn't think about God. They didn't know God. The only experience that they had with Christianity in their life was meeting Paul and Luke on this trip. You know, sometimes you're the only Christianity that somebody's going to see. But suddenly a storm comes and they get to hear a little sermonette about God being in control and how they should be of good cheer. But as you can imagine, Paul doesn't have a lot of buy-in from his audience here. There was this, how could they? I mean, how could he have a lot of buy-in? They were a captive audience, you know. They were in a storm, and the storm was still going off, and they were hearing about God for the first time. They weren't sure what to believe. What are you going to expect from them? That they're going to be mature Christians and think in a mature Christian way? But I want you to pay attention to what Paul does. He gets everybody, number one, to agree to eat something. That makes a lot of situations better. Talked about that. He comforts them also. Reminds them one more time that everybody's going to be safe. No one's going to even lose a hair on their head. I don't know if anybody was bald on the boat, but hopefully that wasn't offensive to them. But look what happens. Verse 30. Don't get me distracted. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread, and look at this, and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. He started the trend. He was a trendsetter. Get this. Paul passed around some food, gave God a prayer of thanks, and then ate. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, the storm is still raging, and the boat was still breaking. Those other passengers weren't sure what to believe. The concept of God was brand new to them. Paul's kind of prayer was a new concept. Paul's kind of faith was a new kind of faith. And think about how powerful this must have been for them to see and hear. Why? Well, you see, it's easy to be calm and give thanks when life is good. And any faith can do that. It's easy to be calm and give thanks after the storm. Any belief system can do that. What will really set people back on their heels is when you're calm and you give thanks and your storm isn't finished yet. That'll really do something. Look, in a storm, we don't exactly know what will happen. But in a storm, I know this. God will give you exactly what you need at that time so that you can go out into the world of believers and the world of unbelievers, and say something like this: I believe God. I know his word is true. I know that he is with me. And I know that nothing passes my way without passing through his awareness first. Yep. And then as you live out that kind of faith publicly in a way that's consistent with that confession, I'll tell you this, people will take notice. You teachers, your students will take notice. Your neighbors will take notice. Your church members will take notice. Your friends will take notice. All the people around you can be affected in a positive way when you decide to go public with your faith. And look, I like that Paul used something as simple as a prayer. These days, I mean, you can just have people jaw drop just by doing something as simple as praying for your meal at a restaurant. And by the way, do you pray with your family at a restaurant? I mean, let me see. And don't out yourself. And you're like, no, I'm going to start now, calling me out in a sermon. All I'm saying is this, it sure is a good opportunity. Sure is a good opportunity. Hey, listen, the economy is a mess. There are evil people out there trying to kill children, obviously. There's fighting politically back and forth. Don't listen to them, listen to us. No, don't listen to them, listen to us. We have the right answer. No, they don't. They don't have the right answer. We have the right answer. They're the enemy. No, they're the enemy. I'm telling you, there are storms all around us, and you might even be going through a storm that I don't know about, and I can actually look through this audience, and I can see some of you, and I know the storms that you're going through because I prayed with you about it. When you're in a storm, it's kind of messy, but how great a message it is to see a family peacefully bowing and thanking God for taking such good care of them. That's a good testimony. Paul used a public prayer of thanks, and you can do the same thing. Prayer, that's just a simple way. I mean, I know it can be a little bit awkward when you're praying at a restaurant. Somebody asks for a refill in water. Your waitress or your waiter asks for it. Can I get we're going to pray real quick. And so they run off, but then they come back to the table and then they have to stand there and just like hold the glass while you're praying. Who cares? Just pray, just be a witness to them, be a testimony to them. Who cares if people are watching? Sometimes it can be a little distracting because it's really loud in there. Just do it. Just do it. Sometimes I ask my girls to pray, and all you hear is like, I don't care. Just let them pray. I don't care. And it's good to see that. It's good to see that in public. You know why? It preaches a message. We can do the same thing. Prayer's simple, but it sure is powerful. But I think that anything you decide to do to go public with your faith is going to be powerful. It's powerful. I'm just thinking about this. It's powerful when you tell someone at your work what you learned in church or learned from your Bible study. Like you go to work and you were like, man, the sermon got me this week. How powerful is that? It's powerful when you get to tell someone what God is doing something in your faith, who's just asking, hey, what's going on in your life? You say, man, God's been good to me. It's powerful when you tell someone how God is getting you through a difficult time in your life. It's powerful. It's powerful when you tell someone, no, I can't do that. I go to church on Sunday. It's powerful. Sends a message, a good message. You know what that is? It's just going public with your faith. Look, I don't care how taboo society says it is. You should never be ashamed of going public about your faith of Jesus Christ. And then look what happens. It's amazing. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. Paul was leading with a public faith, and as a result, again, right there in the middle of the storm, suddenly they were all of good cheer. They weren't listening to Paul before, but they were listening to him now. Storms have a way of doing that, remember. They're a clarifying agent. Storms have a way of helping you listen when you weren't listening before. It may take a storm to get people around you to listen. It may take a storm to get them to finally listen. It may be a storm in your own life that causes someone to finally listen to you. Can I ask you this? Are you ready for that? Are you ready to go public with that? There are people around you that aren't sure what to believe in this world. There are so many directions you could take. There are so many lies to believe. Do you have a faith that can lead them, that can help lead them to the right direction? What those sailors did could have caused more panic. Is that true? What those sailors did could have caused more suffering. What those sailors did could have caused more trouble. But Paul, listen, with a little bit of food and a very public faith, turned that whole thing around. That's pretty incredible. He brought calm in a situation that could have been chaos. He got people thinking about God who otherwise wouldn't have given God a second thought, or who otherwise wouldn't have really known what to think about God. That's called spiritual leadership. They didn't know God before, but because Paul led with a public faith, they learned that his God was worthy of trust. They learned that his God was gracious and kind and in control no matter what was happening around them. They learned that God was always welcoming inside of a conversation. He gave a prayer of thanks. They learned that he was a provider. They got to learn that God was Paul's friend. They learned all kinds of stuff. Look, when the world is struggling with crisis, we lead with integrity. When the world is struggling with their personal beliefs, we lead with a public faith. And here's a final thought that I want to give you. When the world is struggling with direction, lead them with your credibility. Well, just like God said, things started to turn around. Luke says that they spotted a creek and that they thought that they could fit into it with that big massive ship of theirs. So they hoisted a sail, launched off in that direction, and it had to have been a lot of work in that busted up old ship. But we finally read these words. They ran the ship aground. In my mind, I'd like to think that it would have been like those movies where people jump out of the boat and start kissing the ground and grabbing it. It's like land. But hey, listen, the adventure wasn't over yet. After they landed on shore, part of the ship finally broke apart, busted up, and the waves were still pounding against it. And suddenly there was no way to control the situation. And it looks like the soldiers were the first to recognize the dangers of this, the problem with that scenario, because if they didn't have control, they couldn't control the prisoners either. They had prisoners, and if you were guarding prisoners and one got away, any got away, that cost you your life. You might remember back in Acts chapter 16 with a Philippian jailer, when he thought everybody escaped from his jail. What was he about to do? Was he about to lay down on his sword? It was going to happen anyway. He might as well just take his life right there and spare himself the shame. And these Roman soldiers were thinking the same thing. They were thinking things like, hey, this is chaos. Hey, it's easy to jump off the ship and make a run for it. We don't know where we are. You know what we need to do? We just need to take all the prisoners. We need to kill them. But look again at verses 42 and 43. And then the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose. I think that morally, that would have been a hard decision to make for those soldiers. Like maybe the risk is great, but if it were between you and me, I'd rather you lose your life than risking mine. But here's what happened. Julius the centurion came to the rescue. He said, no, fellas, we're not going to be doing that. But did you see why? It wasn't because the soldiers didn't make a good point. It wasn't because there wasn't a real risk to their life. The soldiers had a point. But Julius didn't want to kill the prisoners because of Paul. He wanted to save Paul. Paul was the only reason. I don't know about you, but if I were a prisoner, I would stay as close to Paul as I possibly could. You better believe it. Why? Why Paul? Because Paul had built up a lot of credibility over their time together. He had proven himself to be trustworthy. He had proven himself to be wise and calm in a stressful situation. He'd proven himself to have a sincere faith. He really believed what he said because he lived it out. He'd proven to be helpful. He'd proven to be a good friend. Proven to be a good leader. He kept people calm. He helped encourage people. He helped care for people. The soldiers were about to make a wrong move, but it was Paul's credibility that made a difference when it came to some moral decisions. Paul teaches us that credibility isn't something that one deserves. Credibility, ladies and gentlemen, is something that you earned. You have to earn that to the people from the people around you. It comes at a high price. You know, though, I think that can happen for any Christian. I think we can earn credibility by the way that we live in front of people so that we can help them lead with our life. I recently heard about the testimony. We've got to close, but let me close with this story. I recently heard about a story of a woman named Gail McWilliams. And Gail wrote a book in 2006 called Seeing Beyond, Choosing to See Beyond the Horizon. And in that book, she tells a remarkable story that when she was a young lady, she had diabetes. And the doctors told her that at some point in your life, and we can't say when, but at some point in your life, you will probably lose your eyesight. At that time, she went a little bit further from a young lady, and she met a young man. And they courted, and they became fiancés. She had a fiancé. And while they were getting ready for their wedding, they were weeks away from their wedding, and she and her fiancé were making plans. And it had just got done, the way she tells the story, it just got done with winter, and it was about to be spring. And their wedding was going to be in the spring. And before they had the wedding, they had another doctor's appointment to check up on her health. And when they called her name at the doctor's office, she told them, soon you're going to have to change my last name because I'm about to be married. And, they were excited about that. And while she was there at the doctor's office getting her checkup before getting married, the doctor told her again, hey, it's not looking good. The way the diabetes is progressing, it's just really obvious to us that you are going to lose your eyesight. Not something that you want to hear as a bride-to-be. Can you imagine the drive home? Her fiancé had gone with her, young lady in her 20s, thinking about what married life would be like, knowing that one day your life would change dramatically. And Gail said that they were mostly silent while they were driving home or driving back to town. And here's this young man driving, about to marry someone who would be blind and be disabled. And so she said to him on the ride home, she said, you know, if you don't want to marry me, you don't have to. He said, what are you talking about? Of course I want to marry you. Well, she got home to her little home in Illinois, and there was a cold snap before the spring entered, and there was a big ice storm. And it knocked out the power, and it was dark, and it burst a pipe in the house, and the basement flooded where she was living, and her wedding dress was down in the basement. And sadly, the bottom of the dress was under the water and ruined her dress that she had bought for the wedding. And she said all of this was happening. She said the storm clouds were just gathering over her life. But she married the love of her life anyway. You know, you don't need a pretty dress to be married. Is that true? Yeah, you don't. Don't worry about that. But she kept having to go to the doctor, and her condition kept on progressing, and the doctor said, it's unlikely that you will ever have children. Devastating. By the way, they had 5. Doctors can be wrong sometimes. They had some miscarriages, but eventually they had a little boy. And then with their second child, they were going to have a little girl. They were expecting a little girl, but while she was pregnant, the doctor said, it was a secular doctor with a secular worldview, needed to be preached to a little bit. He said, we've seen the pattern with you. Today you need to decide either your eyes or your baby. If you go through with this pregnancy, it will cause you to lose your eyesight. And she said this, the decision's already been made. We're keeping the baby. The doctor ridiculed her, said that is a foolish decision. Do you understand you're going to lose your eyesight? And she said, my mind was reeling, but went back to Deuteronomy chapter 30 and how that God had said, I have set before you this day life and death. Therefore choose life, that you and your seed may live. She said, I chose life that day. But just like the doctor said, I lost my eyesight. And Gail McWilliams, to this day, travels and speaks and writes, and she wrote a book, the book that I mentioned to you. And by the way, the audio version of that book, her second daughter that was born when Gail was stricken with blindness is the one who reads it. And now her daughter is grown and married and has given grandchildren to Gail McWilliams. Somebody asked Gail, how can you have such joy and yet you can't see? And she asked this, how can you see and not have joy? She said, it was in my darkest hour that my vision was birthed. It was my darkest hour that I really saw just who God is and what God can do through my circumstances. Are you getting this? Gail uses her testimony. She uses her Christian credibility to tell others a world that needs an answer, a world that needs to be led to God. She uses her life to teach that world that God is good even in the middle of the storm. You know, we've had a couple of hard Sundays learning about storms in this church, about how God's will sometimes is not fair, and the storms that come, even though we're in God's will, can be really hard. And I had someone tell me just last week, said, well, I understand more about storms now. I said, that's been a help. But they said, what do I do with it? And I said, well, you're going to have to wait because that's next week. My answer today to you, ask God how you can be a leader. What do you do with your storm? Ask God how you can be a leader. Ask God how he can use you. If you're a Christian, you don't need an official, important title to be a leader. You just need an audience. If you're a Christian, you don't need an impressive resume to be a leader. You just need credibility. If you're a Christian, you don't need a powerful personality to be a leader. You just need a life that points to an all-powerful God. Yeah. Will you stand with me?
Thank you for tuning in to this installment in the current series. While these sermon series are a great tool and a beneficial part of our media ministry, we'd like to remind everyone that they aren't a substitute for being in church and being around God's people. God loves his people and has designed us to grow exponentially when we get around our church family for face-to-face fellowship and congregate worship. While we want to be an encouragement with his word through this podcast, we'd love to be even more of an encouragement to you in person. Join us this coming Sunday at Lake Worth Baptist Church at 11 a.m. for an in-person message from the book. If you like the podcast, please remember to like and share. If you have any questions about this or other messages, or if you'd like to hear more about knowing Jesus personally, please contact us at podcast@lakeworthbaptist.org.